I'm curious, like, what made the problem of AI model verification, feel urgent enough to start Veil? And, how are you seeing this in the market in a way that you think some others may be missing, for example?
The truth is, these models grow in capability. We will use them more. And as they grow in capability, it becomes harder and harder to distinguish between the models themselves. We have an approach for what we call white box fingerprinting, where we can generate a signature or fingerprint for a model. We've seen where models start to behave very inconsistently as the amount of compute resources that they've gotten have shrunk. So you can't assume that the model will behave at the top of its capability when it's given less and less resource.
How do you envision model identity fitting into that?
Who you are or who the agent is will be different time after time after time. So
Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Manish Shah. Manish, thanks for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. You're kind of operating in right up my alley now, where I'm finding myself spending a lot of time and attention on AI, Gen AI, LLMs, agents, everything in between. But for folks that don't know you, don't know your team, can you tell us a bit about your background and the team as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background has been building companies for over 20 years now, all based out of the Bay Area where I live. I started kind of companies from lots of different spaces. Early on, I started a data company called LiveRamp that's still around today, working with lots and lots of data. I also started a healthcare company, which also built a lot of different AI things to help people with their health. And now I'm the co-founder and CEO of Veil, which is working on how to make AI itself verifiable. And we can talk about what that means.
Yeah, you've done quite a few things in diverse industries, all from center around data and AI. It seems like over a couple decades here. I'm curious, like, what made the problem of AI model verification, feel urgent enough to start Veil? And how are you seeing this in the market in a way that you think some others may be missing, for example?
For sure. So, having worked on various kind of scales and sizes of data and AI for my whole career, I've had experience with classic ML models, building kind of the orchestration of them within business. Also in healthcare, working with models and trying to be sensitive to privacy and other kind of topics where you don't want to kind of just share everything outright. But when I started to actually interact with generative models like the early GPTs and whatnot, I had just a very visceral sense that, okay, things are going to change quite dramatically from here. And this is, 3.5 years ago. And so the thesis that we developed was that there's going to be many, many, many millions of different models that are out there and proliferating, whether you call them a singular model with a set of weights or these agentic applications now that are now doing complex tasks on our behalf. The truth is that as these models grow in capability, we will use them more. And as they grow in capability, it becomes harder and harder to distinguish between the models themselves. So we won't really know if this is Opus 4.6 or Opus 4.7 behind the scenes, or GLM5 in a harness like OpenClaw that's doing things. And for me, and just kind of as we as society become more dependent on these AI systems to kind of do critical tasks and be the heart of critical applications, it became important to know, well, how can we know which model is at the root of this application that we're now using? And more so, as our models become trusted by us, and then they go out and start interacting with other models or other agentic systems, it will be important for the models that we trust to know how to trust the other models. And without being able to verify the identity of the other model or the other agent on the other side of this API, it's really hard to build that kind of trust layer. And so that's what Veil set out to try to bring to the surface. How can we actually verify which model is running behind this API or within this agentic application that we are kind of trusting more and more?
Yeah, you use the term identity in relation to a model, which usually I almost always hear it tied to, of course, users, but also agents, is kind of the dominant conversation. And like you all have taken, kind of a different angle, which is like a focus on behavioral fingerprinting, if I'm not mistaken, which is a core innovation on your end. Like, how does that behavioral fingerprinting actually work? Like, you're not looking at model weights or architecture, you're analyzing how the model behaves at inference, is that right?
That's right.
And how do you kind of create a fingerprint from that? And it's also spoof resistant and so on.
So let's kind of step through that in like from where what we might do today. So in typical like S bombs and now AI bomb applications, you might generate a digest of some like a hash of the model like files, right? And some of those files are the configurations, but also like the set of weights, which is kind of what the model is, like its body is, right? But just having a digest of a static set of weights doesn't tell you which model is actually running when you're calling it through an API, or even if you're hosting the model yourself, you don't really know which model is loaded in memory and is going to be performing that inference for you, right? That's at runtime. So what we found to be important is that we have to identify these things as they are running, and running is kind of the equivalent of how they are behaving, right? Their identity is kind of determined by how do they behave in certain conditions through certain kind of interactions that we have. And so that's what we kind of broadly describe as behavioral fingerprinting. Can we detect a signature of this model based on its behavior, given the things that we're asking it to do? And can we do that very, very efficiently? Meaning, how many tokens does it take for us to extract some kind of signature or fingerprint for this model at this time? And then we can do other things on top of that, or in sequence, once we have that capability, being able to do it very, very frequently or continuously. And so that's kind of
Do you
how
mind if I
behavioral
ask you?
fingerprinting works.
Can I ask you a follow-up question there? Like, you used the phrase AI bomb, S bomb, digest. My mind went in a few directions as you were talking about that. So first off, like, I was tracking the software supply chain stuff pretty closely several years back with Log4j and SolarWinds, and S bomb became like a dominant part of the conversation. Then a big challenge was with like SaaS providers, right? You don't have the visibility of the internal components. You need them to provide you that. Like, when you think of this behavioral fingerprinting, like you talked about models and weights and things like that, how does that work with frontier labs and frontier models where you may not have that full level of transparency from the provider? How do you navigate that in terms of doing behavioral fingerprinting? And then also, as you were talking about that, I couldn't help but think about the term distillation as well. But I don't know if this is a direct corollary to that, or if, a naive take on my end. I'm curious.
No. It's all relevant. All relevant. So the key piece is that if we don't control the full package of what we're using, we have to find other mechanisms to kind of verify what is being run in this system that I'm using, right? So in a SaaS application, yes, your SaaS vendor may tell you which model or which sets of things are running when you're putting in your sensitive information to. But how do you verify? Because even with models that you might see on places like Hugging Face, you get a model card that tells you about this model, but you can't really verify that what's written in the model card is what you're getting when you're running that model at inference time, right? So the whole objective of runtime or behavioral fingerprinting is about how can we verify these traits about this model without having full access to the model's internals. So if you're accessing this model through an API, can we verify just based on the behavior or the outputs from that model what it is, right? And so there's different techniques that we deploy to do this. We have a approach for what we call white box fingerprinting, where we can generate a signature or fingerprint for a model. And then you mentioned distillation. Can we determine if this model that I'm accessing is related to or is derived from a different model that we also have a fingerprint for. So in the case of distillation, you have a model that has been distilled from a larger, more maybe a smarter model, and it's meant to kind of behave similarly to that model that it was distilled from. So the fingerprint maintains some kind of relationship. So if you have a fingerprint of model A and a fingerprint of model B, and you know model B, or you have some suspicion that model B was distilled from model A, you should be able to see that in the data, right? And that's all derived from the output behavior of the model. Now, in the other case where you're relying on a SaaS vendor to provide you an API, or it wraps around a model that is run somewhere else that's not in your infrastructure, you should be able to also kind of interrogate that API to see which model is it. And sometimes, if it's a closed model like an Anthropic Claude model, say, or a GPT, you may not be able to say, I know that this model is very specifically GPT-5.4, but what you can say is, well, when I was accessing this model 2 weeks ago, it had this kind of behavior pattern. Now, 2 weeks later, that pattern may have changed. And what behavioral fingerprinting would be able to tell you is that it changed, that it's not the same model that it was 2 weeks ago. And that could be for a variety of reasons. They could have rerouted you to a different model. They could have swapped the model to something that's less, that's more compressed. If you've heard of quantization, that's another way that different model providers try to make better use of their compute resources, because these frontier models are quite large and very complex and hard to serve. And so they're doing lots of optimizations behind the scenes that changes the behavior pattern of the model. And so that's what we try to detect, is this model the same as 2 weeks ago, and will it be the same 2 weeks from now? Because if you are kind of building your applications with the assumption that this model is that you've evaluated, that you've red teamed, that you've gone through these aggressive assessments with, how do you know that that is still true all the way into deployment and post in production, right? So that's really what the point of continuous monitoring or continuous fingerprinting can tell you, is that this model that you kind of built trust in hasn't changed, and that you can continue to trust it.
Yeah, if I could ask, say I'm an enterprise, large, industry CISO or security team, or, a security practitioner, basically, right? And you're getting that assurance around the model, or even if you're like a CIO, CTO, whomever, it feels like these frontier labs, just using them as an example, let alone the open source, ecosystem and so on, the model cadence is literally like 16 weeks sometimes, or from these large labs. How do you see enterprises kind of adopting these models, in the sense that do they truly stick with one model? Because it feels like everyone kind of jumps to whatever the latest is, without truly understanding, some of the nuances that you're talking about from risk management perspective. Everyone just jumps to the newest model, and maybe that's voluntarily, or intentionally, from a leadership perspective. But maybe it's bottoms up, developer-led adoption, right? They just jump to the latest model because they want to use the latest and greatest.
Right.
How do you think about it in the enterprise risk management context?
I don't think anyone has a good plan for how to deal with the rapid pace of innovation that's happening within the labs, and the hyper competitive nature that they have to kind of continue to one up each other. And us on the user side, or the enterprise user side, we're kind of it's hard to catch our breath and to say hey, we need to switch from just today, Opus 4.7 just came out, right? So now maybe we were still trying to migrate from Opus 4.5 to 4.6, and now 4.7 is here. What do we do, right? So I think this is really stressing enterprise leaders, whether you're a CISO or CIO or CTO, or even like a product manager, right? Because it might be fine for your engineering, individual contributor engineers, to switch from the last coding model to the new coding model, because it's really just for them, right? But when you're building these agentic workflows that you're exposing to an entire organization or to your customers, there's much more on the line, right? So do the same kind of prompt templates and things that you have built and curated and kind of refined for your application use case. Do those still apply to the new model? And so you have to do a whole battery of tests again. You need to go through your evaluations again. You need to probably do your red teaming and other assessments again before you bless the new model from entering your kind of organization and kind of being run within your firewall, even exposed to your customers, right? And so that's really just challenging. So I think the important piece is to know when you're ready to ship this this model into production, or this system into production that relies on these models, that it is behaving as you need it to. And the other important piece to beware of is that sometimes how the model behaves isn't fully in your control, and it definitely affects your application, whether it's the sensitivity of secure information or the abilities of that model. So we've seen where models start to behave very inconsistently as the amount of compute resources that they've gotten have shrunk. So you can't assume that the model will behave at the top of its capability when it's given less and less resource. And those resources might be kind of reallocated to the new model, right? And so even if you're not ready from a change management perspective to switch from 4.5 to 4.7 or GPT 5.2 to 5.4, you're almost like forced into it, because you can't just keep running your application at the older model when the older model is getting kind of neutered in a way because it's getting less compute resources, right? So there's all these kind of things that I think are frustrating for enterprise leaders, because they're kind of held to these standards, but they have no control over them, right?
Yeah, yeah. Really... as you were saying that, I was kind of laughing on mute here, because several things you were talking about have been part of the popular kind of dialogue going on right now. Like, for example, there's been speculation with Mythos where some were saying, well, Opus isn't behaving the same, and it's like, is it because they diverted resources to Mythos? I don't know. Like, people are really speculating about what's going on, and then some have speculated that Mythos wasn't publicly released because compute constraints, not because of the cyber thing. So like, as you're talking, these things are actually part of the popular dialogue going on around AI right now, it feels like too. I was going to ask you too, we talked a little bit about distillation, and that made me think of nation states, particularly of course US and China. And I think you all have some research use cases on detecting whether open source models are derived from Chinese origin models like DeepSeek or Qwen. From a national security or enterprise risk perspective, why does model lineage and provenance matter? And what are some policy implications if organizations simply can't verify that or have no means to try to verify it?
Well, first, I would say that we're trying to provide the means to verify these things. And I do think it's important that we do so, because if you can't really understand the provenance of a model, you really don't know what it's capable of doing, especially what it's capable of doing that's latent or hidden within what you ask it to do, right? And so, I think not just us saying this, but there's been studies from NIST and other places that show, actually Anthropic put out a study about how Chinese models or Chinese open source models have a higher alignment to CCP rhetoric, right? So if you're a US based organization, or you're the US government and you're trying to kind of use AI to do things more efficiently, now you let in a model that has more alignment to not the culture or core values of your country, then that's a vulnerability, right? And so just like we don't want any U.S. president that was not born in the U.S., right? That's a kind of a key feature, I guess. Similar things will apply to these AI systems that we now kind of underpin society with, right? This is going to be the building blocks or the foundation of military actions, of policy generation, policy enforcement. There's all kinds of ways where AI is going to be the bedrock of society. And so I think it's important to know what are those core values that these models are now trained with, and so the importance of that is how can we detect that this model was from a source that we trust, right? So one of the things is that if you just kind of pull a model from somewhere, like let's say, not to pick on them, but Hugging Face is a popular place where people go to browse for new models that are now ready to be used, right? And you can think like, oh, I have this model, these are the weights, I'm running it myself, we're okay. But you actually want to do some kind of analysis to know where did this model come from. And oftentimes, like there's models that get posted on Hugging Face that aren't fully disclosing where they came from, or that they could have, just like I said with the model cards earlier, you don't really know if everything is in the model card that describes the model, right? So if this new model that shows up is actually a derivative of Kimi or GLM or Quen, but it's not disclosed by the model provider, then you're kind of like not really sure. You might be lured into this false sense of security in that way, right? And we're kind of relying on the just outright honesty of whoever's providing that model to say that it wasn't just fine-tuned off of this Chinese base model or this other country. Pick your country. Like there's going to be lots and lots of these that people might choose as their base, right?
Yeah, there's the parallel between open source and then the kind of the open source software traditionally, right, and then the rise of Hugging Face and open models. There's so many parallels there when it comes to software supply chain security, and the concept of just blindly trusting that is not smart. You like the last 30, 45 days, there's been like 6 major supply chain incidents on the open source software side of things.
Right.
So yeah, don't, blind trust in open source is never necessarily a great thing. I was going to ask, but the same of course can be said for commercial providers. I'll throw that out there. But
For sure.
we know that there's compelling use cases for AI and LLMs in every industry, right? Financial services, healthcare, government, defense, all these regulated industries as well. I'm curious your stance on like these, kind of the current compliance frameworks and things that are out there. Like think NIST AI RMF, EU AI Act, ISO. How do they, measure up or fall short when it comes to model verification? And what do you think how do you feel the regulators are doing on that front?
I think that these regulations are kind of doing their best to provide some kind of framework to assess these things. And, just thinking about it more broadly, like you're trying to put a box around something that is like growing so rapidly and wildly, like you can't really contain it at this moment. So I think they're best efforts. And, we've seen early policy ideas around like, oh, well, if the model has like this number of flops and it's above that, then it kind of now is in this other class, which I think is just, if you don't really understand the technology and like how things are being built, I think that's it might sound like a good idea, but in the end, it's not that great, because you could distill from a 5 trillion parameter model into a 5 billion parameter model, and now you're like safe, quote unquote, based on the number of flops. But that model could be way more potent than the larger model, right? And actually way more accessible, because you could just run it on a laptop instead of needing a giant data center to run it, right? So I think there's a lot of best effort things in these various regulations. It's really hard to know if any of them are like helpful. I mean, we're going to try. I think it's a good idea to try, but things are moving so fast and changing so fast that what I think is more important that we focus on is the tooling, right? So, I'm not trying to pick on open source. Like, we love open source. We believe that open source models are a net benefit to society. We want to see more of them, but we also should up-level our tooling to understand what these things are, how they get used, because the scale of this and the pace at which it's moving is going to outstrip any kind of policy definition that you put on paper. Until you have scalable programmatic tooling to assess these things for what you deem to be important. Like for us, how do we verify model identity? Like that's something that we find to be important. And it's not something that we can just do statically and kind of like rubber stamp a model and say you're good. It's something that needs to be done continuously and at a very high pace and wherever these models end up being run. So that's kind of what I would say is that I think those regulations, whether it's like, the NIST frameworks or RMF or EU AI Act, I think they're all, trying to do something and to provide some kind of assurances to society that, we're on the job. But I do think that we need to invest more in the tooling that's going to allow these systems to kind of surface the best models and the best uses and the most productive and healthy uses, and make it harder for those malicious uses to see the light of day.
Yep, makes sense. So you used the phrase tools. That was going to take me to actually one of my last questions for you is, you've kind of laid out this prerequisite of, granting AI access for models, having some assurance, right? But now we're seeing, you talked about OpenClaw, I think earlier, we're seeing the rise of OpenClaw and, all these comparable offerings from the big labs now, computer use models, endpoint coding agents, agentic browsers, all these things that are accessing like enterprise data, resources, tools, tool calls, etc. Like, how do you envision model identity fitting into that, kind of that paradigm? And, it feels like everyone is just simply granting broad access at the moment with no assurance of, let alone the agent, but the model's involved too. And, I think
many are permissions.
Yes, exactly. I feel like
Yes.
many are missing this basically.
Yes. So I think there's a couple things. Identity for AI isn't going to map the same way to how we provide or manage identity for human actors, right? Or principles in that way. The identity of a model is a changing trait. As an agent, for example, like let's say you have your OpenClaw, or now Hermes is the hot one, right? You install it, now you've added some things to it, and it starts to do things for you. And then you start to update it, right? You update its sole MD file, or you add new skills to it. You give it more permissions. The identity of that agent is now different, right? Because it might take on a different persona as you start using it. You might give it tools that let it be more systems administrator as opposed to like a deep researcher, right? Very different. Those are very different traits and behaviors that you might experience with those agents in that makeup. So I think the important piece is, how do you periodically check what is the current state of this agent? What is its identity at this time? How does it compare to a previous time? And then what could we say about where is it going, right? Is it getting more secure, less secure? Is it getting more aggressive in a way with what it chooses to do, what it chooses to not do? And people are actually starting to talk about this, like, oh, my agent wanted to be helpful to me, so it actually did something that I actually explicitly told it not to do. So it's like, it's kind of violating some of its own principles in a way, to try to like really adopt this identity and persona that you've given it, right? And so that's where we think it's important to not treat these agent systems or harnesses as like a one-time, here's your identity, your credentials to go do things, right? Because who you are, or who the agent is, will be different time after time after time. So you kind of need to recheck, reassess. Is this the right set of credentials? Is it the right level of access that we want to provide, given the state of this agent at this moment in time?
Yeah, it's a fascinating way to frame it. And honestly, I think to my point I was mentioning earlier, I think it's something that many are not thinking about. And honestly, like in the conversation around AI security, I feel like this the verification piece of the model, the assurance, the things that you've talked about, behavioral fingerprinting, are something that warrant much more conversation. So I appreciate you coming on and kind of dropping some wisdom on us, Manish, and it's great to hear some of the research you all are up to. Where can folks learn more? Follow up with you guys and so on.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing this space for people to hear this, because it's really important. Where you can learn more about us is at just basically following us on our website. We publish a lot of our work at projectvail.com, VAIL.com, and you can find me on X or on LinkedIn. I'm MN Shaw on either of those places.
Awesome. Thanks so much for jumping on, and thanks for folks who tuned in. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much.